We recommend GND filters as being a great way to learn how to improve your exposure and understand exposure within landscape photography. When we first started out doing landscape work using film, the GND filter was literally the only way to make a successful image. The GND filters work like a pair of sunglasses, except they're split in the middle, so there's a darker portion at the top and a clear portion at the bottom. I say top and bottom, that could be the other way around, but I've never ever in my life used a GND filter in reverse. So what we're doing basically is trying to darken the sky so as the exposure results up here equal the exposure results in a darker foreground. So we're trying to darken down the brighter areas. We don't use GND filters quite as much as we used to, just because of the dynamic range that cameras have these days. It's less and less necessary to use one. However, I do think that they're probably the best way to learn how to photograph landscape photography, as I said just earlier. So I'm going to show you a couple of tips with regards to using them, and we will go from there. So this is a fairly good example of a situation where we need to have some kind of intervention for exposure to be optimal or optimized for this scene. It's clearly too dark down here in the shadows and too bright in the sky to be collected in one single frame. So I'm going to take one shot here at the camera's recommended exposure, and as we can see, we've blown out at the tops, and at the bottom here we're getting very close to being having clipping in the shadows. So if we were to then shoot an overexposed for the foreground, we're going to start getting good detail down here in the foreground, but as we can see on the histogram here, we're cooking out in the sky, so that means we have to do another shot. Underexposed, we'll take a stab in the dark there. So rather than creating 3 shots and splicing them together or merging them in HDR, we can try just using a GND filter, which is what I recommend you do when you're starting out in landscape photography, simply because you take the post-processing out of the equation and you'll start making nice shots out in the field. It's great for your learning, and you start to understand the limitations of your camera a lot quicker. So when we use a GND filter, all we're doing is hand-holding it across the front of the camera. So you can see my fingers creeping into frame there on the left bottom. We don't want them then, ultimately they'll be gone in a moment, and as you can see, as I drop the curtain down over the darker area, the whole exposure becomes much more balanced. Let's take that. Look at that, almost perfect. Everything is ready for post-processing. We've got the entire scene nicely encapsulated within the histogram. The GND filter has effectively increased the dynamic range of that camera through that simple act of putting it over the lens.